Welcome everyone to the second CGHE seminar from our 2020 annual conference program. And today we're going to look at two topic areas. One is the digital higher education, and the second one is academic careers and academic work. So we're going to take those two topics in half-hour segments. Our presenters will present for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A on each topic. So between now and just after 1:30, we're talking about the digital higher education, and in the second half hour, academic careers and academic work. Just to quickly run through the web protocols that some of you will have heard before. Remember that the webinar is being recorded and it'll be posted online on the CGHE website not long after the webinar. The transcript of the chat function will also be posted, so you'll be able to see yourself in both forms. Now, please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please do so when asking a question. It certainly makes it a more pleasant experience for all of us if we can see you. We recommend using the speaker view so you can more clearly see who is talking. You can ask questions during the webinar or at the end of the presentation, and you can do that by putting your question in the chat. And I think if you want to get selected as a questioner, that's a very sensible thing to do, because then we know what you're going to ask and we can ensure that you get properly placed in the program of questions. Now, when you're invited to ask a question, please unmute yourself. That's the most important step. Switch on your video and state your name and where you are from. So at this point, I'd like to commence the seminar, the webinar proper. Our first presentation is from the team of Eileen Kennedy and Diana Laurillard. Eileen is a senior research associate with CGHE based at the UCL Knowledge Lab, who's exploring the transformative potential of digital technologies in higher education. Diana, who we're expecting to come online soon, is the Professor of Learning with Digital Technologies at UCL Knowledge Lab, former head of the Learning Strategy Unit at the Department of Education and Skills, a worldwide, well-known expert on digital learning. So at this point, let me hand over to you, Eileen.
Hi. Just going to share my screen. There you go. All right, so I'm hoping Diana will pop up during the course of this. You know, Trevor, you might want to just email her with a link to the webinar, just in case. But what I'm going to talk about today then is, you know, a report on a series of interviews with participants in a MOOC that I conducted in order to get onto the right place, in order to show the ways that those participants, particularly professional participants, were able to learn on a MOOC. These participants showed themselves to be highly reflective and experienced learners who had remarkable insights into how they were learning online. Some of the findings might be surprising, and I'm hoping that could inform universities' the current move that, to online, to teaching online that's going on at the moment. But it's also important to remember that the participants that I was talking to were, you know, seasoned professionals rather than younger, less experienced learners. But I just want to point out to begin with that even though the term MOOC is used a lot and everyone knows, I think probably by now, that it stands for Massive Open Online Course, there are markedly different kinds of MOOCs out there. For example, MOOCs where university lecturers stand and talk at the camera, and you might get a quiz if you're lucky, but others where a social learning experience is created involving peer knowledge exchange, and videos are shot on location, showing ideas in action. An example of this latter type of MOOC is any of those that we're co-designing at the moment with communities of professionals in Lebanon for the Relief Centre. This MOOC, which was called Transforming Education in Challenging Environments, featured interviews with refugee teachers who were teaching children in informal refugee camps in Lebanon. Peer discussion is foregrounded, and here you can see participants exchanging ideas for activities for transformative education in low resource concepts, inspired by the teachers in the video. For this CG research project, I interviewed participants who had generally experienced many varieties of MOOCs, and I asked them to compare these to get deep into the ways they learn on MOOCs. I adapted the repertory grid technique and used an interactive whiteboard, as most of the interviews were online. Participants were able to create a series of evaluation polls for MOOCs and mapped their MOOCs, the MOOCs they participated in, onto those polls, indicating where the ideal course would go according to this scale. And I also recorded and analysed the discussion while that was taking place. So it was quite an involved process, and it was very participatory. I was able to identify themes across the participants' grids first, and then I used those themes to start the analysis of the interviews and generate finer grained codes within overarching themes. And I'm going to focus on only two of those themes today, because I think that they relate to social learning. Well, they do relate to social learning and digital engagement, but I think that they are key areas for us at the moment with the mass pivot online. A feature that differentiated MOOCs, apart from their size, of course, from the smaller online courses that preceded them, was the use of video. But participants were clear that not all videos were the same. And videos that were shot on location, they considered to be fascinating and motivated them to rush ahead and watch more. But on the other hand, you know, they thought others were kind of a bit of a slog, and it wasn't always that they weren't well produced. Sometimes when they were too slick, they didn't like that. They wanted to see a human being, the personality, to get to know the educator. And they didn't see the point in a talking head. They wanted at least some animation, some diagram, something moving, or why have a video at all? A lot of participants talked about interactivity, but it's not always easy to pin down what it means. It's quite a complex and shifting construct. Sometimes it involves social presence, you know, the feeling that other people are there posting in the course. And as someone says, if you don't have that, you lose people. At other times, it's the difference between watching a documentary and having a learning experience, not a passive experience. So you do things like submit voice recordings. But it's also to do with the design of the platforms. A participant who was an instructional designer called it Designing for Delight. So this complex and technical and social experience is digital engagement or interactivity. And that was also related to another theme, discussion and social learning. Often MOOCs are perceived as being merely video learning. And for many of the participants that that I'm talking about here, it really wasn't that. It was about discussion that they learned from the discussion the most. This feeling of being involved in the course was part social or human, and part technological. So if the platforms can email you to let you know someone has replied, it brought participants pleasure and gave them confidence. Participants enjoyed the back and forth of discussion with peers from around the world and having different kinds of people like doctors and patients discussing in the same place. They suggested it was like being able to attend a conference every day without the need for time and expense. And like being at a conference, they pointed to occasions where they learned specifically from peers sharing links or ideas, and were able to supply the kind of contextualized knowledge that comes from being a professional, trying things out in practice. Finally, all the participants saw value in the educators taking part in the discussion. I asked them specifically what that brought to learning. Once again, it made having the educators there made it feel like that they weren't just talking to a machine, but there was someone listening. And they didn't want the educators to be distanced from them, just being seen in the videos. It made them more human if they took part in the discussions, more friendly, more engaging. So there's an interesting lesson for online educators. Don't be a newsreader, be a human being. What was also surprising, perhaps, was that even though they liked it a lot when educators were in the discussion, they were all happy with the course mentors taking their place as well. So in conclusion, we argue that this shift towards MOOCs for interactive social learning could change popular understanding of their potential to transform universities' approach to knowledge exchange with professionals. Now, has Diana turned up?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yes. Yeah, great. So Diana, do you want to
I will just ask when to advance the slides, Eileen. Okay,
just
so
shout and I'll do it.
That's exactly what we've seen in the education system's response to the pandemic, in fact. We're now in a phase where educators have been able to discover for themselves what digital methods can do. This kind of forced migration to online learning has demonstrated clearly that digital technology is the most far-reaching means of access to education. But teachers in all sectors still need help with optimizing how to do it. Luckily, digital methods such as MOOCs and other online learning platforms provide just the kind of platform that professionals need to learn and build knowledge together. So here's the evidence. Could you take the next slide, please? 3 months ago, we contributed to the rapid development of the FutureLearn MOOC, How to Teach Online. Now, that has been running since the 23rd of March, and it's had over 40,000 teachers from all sectors and many countries participating in this course. It was created at speed, so the course had almost no videos, but it did have a lot of useful links to resources and tools. And in the comments, it has thousands of comments in the discussions which are related to each step. So this is precisely where professionals are able to learn from each other. We've also in that period created a course in Arabic called Teaching Online in response to a request from some of our co-researchers at the Lebanese University in Lebanon, whose teachers were just desperate for help. And since it began, that one began on the 26th of April, that's had over 24,000 participants from across the Middle East and North African region. And they've also been sharing their ideas and their problem solutions on Padlet. There's an example in Arabic, and due to the wonders of Google Translate, if you look at that in Chrome, you can get it to translate the whole page. So we can even see what our participants are saying. And so that's a very nice way, a very visual, pictorial way to share ideas. The final slide. Just to summarize, as Eileen has shown, this shift towards MOOCs for interactive social learning is indeed changing our potential to transform universities' approach, both to knowledge exchange and knowledge building with other professionals. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. And I'm going to cut across this interesting presentation and ask you the big question. which is on in everyone's minds, and of course has been the subject of much speculation. After the pandemic, if there is an after the pandemic, are we looking at a fundamental change in the role of digital learning in the universities?
Do you want to go first, Eileen?
Well, are we looking at changing the university's relationship with digital education? Is that what you're saying, Simon?
Well, I said the role of digital learning.
Okay, role of digital learning. It's already changed, hasn't it? Now it's already changed. Everybody has jumped online. Everybody, all the things that people said that they couldn't do previously, they've been able to do. It was, there was an enormous amount of resistance to, taking that leap. But now it's happened. I think that's it. We're not going backwards. How we take that forward, that's a different thing. And there's lots of ways in which I think that we would prefer that to happen. But I think this is a very exciting time for digital learning or learning online.
Yeah, it's a very important question to ask. And I think it is a watershed moment because, as Eileen said, it's enabled people to discover that they can actually do it, that it does have not just benefits because we're all in lockdown, but also it has its own intrinsic benefits of the ways in which you can have much more asynchronous activity by students that you become aware of as a teacher. There are many different ways in which online learning provides genuine enhancements to what we do in teaching. So I don't think, as Eileen said, that we will go back to pre-COVID in the way that we use digital technology. I think universities will start exploring much more the advantages and opportunities that digital learning provides, and have much more blended learning. And we might even move into having more what I would call hybrid courses. Maybe where some people come to study at UCL and other such places for part of their course. They might come for a semester, a term, a year, and blend in, mix up both the campus-based and the home-based. Now, if we were to do that, it would really change the accessibility of higher education. Because at the moment, we're very dependent on essentially very well-off overseas students. That's not inclusive. That does not even fit with our professed mission. Mm-hmm. So I think it is an opportunity to rethink.
I'm quite sure that the webinar will partly displace the seminar. I mean, the way in which the webinars that we've ran as a research centre have worked so well and bringing in 100+ people from all over the world into every conversation, with about 60% of them coming from outside the UK. But that would indicate that, certainly our future lies with this kind of global discussion, and the potential to use that as a teaching tool is there as well. I've got a number of questions already, and I'm going to ask Claudia Saraco to ask the first question. So can you unmute, Claudia?
Sorry, I have my husband here now talking to somebody else with teleworking under difficult conditions. So do you want to ask the question in my behalf? I don't think it will be, I think you will hear my husband on the background now.
I understand. Let's just bring up your question. And your question is, and Diana, it's one, and Eileen, it's one you will have heard before. Can you please discuss how to bridge the divide between the different types of students, especially those that are academically stronger and those that need more support in their learning online?
Shall I begin on this one? If we take it alternately, Eileen, so we're not...
Yes, I think that's a good idea.
Negotiating this. We always have to worry about that because there are always students who are academically stronger than others. And one of the opportunities we have with online learning, I think, is that we can differentiate a bit more easily than you can sometimes do in face-to-face teaching. So one of the difficulties for many students is being able to stand up and say something in front of a class, especially as we have a lot of students for whom English is not their mother tongue. And it's a big thing for them to make the effort to ask a question or to make a point in class. And those are the very people that you see in an online context where it's asynchronous and they can take their time to think about how to ask a question or phrase a point. They are vociferous So we have to be aware also of those kinds of advantages to make provision for those too. Now, one of the things we certainly have to worry about is students who are sufficiently weak that they procrastinate, they need a lot of help, they need support, and they need very often individual support. Now, especially for those, again, with online learning, when it's much easier for us to track their progress through a course. So if you're running your course on Moodle, for example, you can see when each student last joined that course. And if they haven't been there for a couple of weeks or more, then you chase them. So we have these huge advantages with these tools to enable us to more personalize the way in which we see the students and the way in which we respond to them, and the opportunities we give them to make the best possible learning experience that they can have. So we have to be imaginative and creative, and we have to understand what's possible, but those things are all possible.
I'd like to, for the second question, bring in Laili Hartel, who's in Surabaya in Indonesia. Laili, can you come in? If you can't come in easily, I can read your question.
So, okay, good. Ready? Can you guys see me and hear my voice? Okay. Good evening. It's evening now in Indonesia. So I will just directly ask you my question. So how would you suggest me as the teacher and my college, of course, to build our students' motivation to go like online schooling during this pandemic? Because from my interview with my students from last semester, they really feel like exhausted as schools, all courses are being forced to be directed online, and they were going back to their own like house, or like some of them are even in the countryside where you know the signal is another thing to consider, and they have to spend like lots of money to go online. So please.
Okay, you know, this is, I don't think it's just students as well that are feeling exhausted. I mean, I think lots of people are feeling exhausted at the moment because there's also so much else happening. You know, so this is a difficult time to be learning online. But, you know, Diana mentioned this like key thing, like doing things asynchronously. I think a lot of the time when people started to teach online during the pandemic, that everybody shifted to platforms like this, you know, and like these kinds of video conferences are kind of exhausting for everybody. You know, you can only cope with it for a little amount of time, but the rest of the time you can provide, if you can provide activities for students to work through, and then if they can get feedback from other people in maybe less intense ways, but certainly, you know, things can be just as collaborative and joyful, really, as seeing somebody's face. So, you know, one of the things that we use in the MOOCs, a lot of things like word cloud activities and Padlets, and well, we saw a Padlet there, or like polls, things like that, very kind of low risk activities. You know, you might not want to put something in a discussion forum, but you know, you're happy to click on a poll question. And those kinds of things give you a sense that you're not on your own in your house, you know, sort of trying to study on your own. There are other people there. So I think that is the key with online learning in terms of giving people motivation, is having activities to do that then they could share with their participants and see that other people are working alongside them. And it's less intense on the bandwidth, you know, which is very expensive, and not everybody has it. So, you know, it's those kinds of things, isn't it? It's this the key thing is the learning design, you know, designing it to sort of be for when you're talking to them and also when you're not there. I don't know, you maybe do all that already.
Yeah, I did. And can I add one more question, please? So, because next semester we are accepting new students. Okay, so they are just graduating from their senior high school, and they are entering college for the first time, and there is online classes where probably they haven't experienced it in their like past. So Can you introduce me from your, for examples, like experiences with your students, how to like introducing them with this system, with this exhausting system that they haven't experienced? Yeah.
Well, that is very important, because you have to think yourself inside their head. And one of the very important things for you is that you're experiencing this now yourself. Now, any teacher who is moving to teaching online, I would always advise them to go and take an online course before they do anything with their own teaching. And I can't tell you how few teachers there are who actually take that advice. But anyway, you really need to have that sense of what's it like to be there with this machine, which has 1,000 interesting things to do. And you're supposed to be concentrating on this 50-minute lecture with a talking head and a few slides. So you realize from that experience that is not the way to do it. Now, you've very sensitively thought about what do you do with those students when they first come? And you've got to think about what are they going to be feeling like? So that first meeting online, the very first thing you have to do is to make sure that people are able to get online, that they can access it, that they have decent broadband and devices and so on. And if they don't, then there has to be somebody in your institution whose job it is to help them, provide advice, a help desk, you know, something like that. So that's the sine qua non. That's like not being able to get through the main entrance to the university. You know, if you can't even do that, then nothing happens. Then there you all are, and you want to hear from them pretty quickly. But people can be shy, you know, they're not that ready necessarily to say anything. So at least make use of the chat and get people to introduce themselves or to say why have they come on the course or what's worrying them most and so on, so that you can get them to start that kind of discussion, which you can then respond to. And you as the teacher will be, in the context of online learning, providing much more advice and guidance to what they do when you're not there. And that's another critical thing, because what we do in our universities, if we have a master's course, for example, we have something which is called self-directed learning. Now, we give a 3-hour session, 10 weeks of the term, and then we have a project or assignment that they do. And then there's a lot of other things which are called reading and reading around and self-directed learning. So we rely on our students to do a lot for themselves. But with online, you can actually orchestrate that a bit. You can set up a study guide which says, okay, read this, look at the most important points, join your small group, discuss with them, decide which of those points you're going to put into your essay. You know, you can just put that guidance there in your VLE, which is so supportive for them. So the more you can think yourself into the mind of the student who's anxious, nervous, but excited, and enable them to get excited and do things, so you create more active learning where they are contributing something.
Okay.
But I would say, you know, join the Future Learn MOOC. It's running all the time.
So actually,
I'm going to have to ask you both to hold back at this point because we do have a lot more questions.
Okay, thank you.
And we've only got time for a couple more before we move to the second session. So can I bring in Hong Bui at this stage? Hong Bui.
Yes, thank you very much, Simon, and two speakers. My question is that if everyone jumps online, as you said, do you think education technology companies might take over the role of universities because they have a content and they have a technologies which might be faster than facilitates the change faster than teachers to change, adapt to the technology? So what's your views on that?
Yeah, I think that's a big concern, and it's been a concern that I've had for a long time, because one of the ways in which it's where the sort of the encroachment of ed tech firms into universities has come about is around the sort of lack of real understanding, or people not being really comfortable with education and technology, and so they kind of are happy to outsource it, thinking it's going to be, you know, just peripheral to the main business of the university. But as we've seen, that has shifted quite dramatically in the last few months, and we think it's going to remain like that. So we can't allow that. The trouble in some ways with ed tech companies is that they're coming at it from with a technological solution rather than a teaching solution. And what we've got to do is make sure that this stuff is pedagogically led, but also that those people who are teaching really understand what the capabilities of technology is. And you're right, that companies respond way faster technologically than universities do. They could develop things themselves, but it's so slow. It's you know, it doesn't work. So what I think the thing is that we do need a bit of that innovation, but we fundamentally need to have universities leading, you know, in terms of developing you know, education and technology, online learning. And if there's anything that you know, comes out of this is this pandemic, is I hope the idea that it will actually put the education and technology higher on the agenda of universities, and they will start to take control. But I think it's a big concern.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Eileen, and the tremendous interest that this presentation is generating from the 110 or so participants is shown by the large number of questions which are still remaining to be asked and answered. But I'm going to bring in one more before we switch topics, and that's from Lynn Newen.
Thank you for giving me the time. I am Linh Nguyen, a PhD student from Monash University, and I would like to have the question for subjects that require the subjects that require face-to-face encounters in the laboratory, like chemistry or pharmacy or biomedicine, how can we facilitate learning for those subjects? Could you please comment on that? And thank you.
Well, very briefly, I'll begin by saying one of the things you can do online when you can't get into the wet lab is you can prepare students for being in the wet lab. And there's a lot you can do to enable them to understand the experimentation better, or to understand the field work better before they ever go into the field, and so on. So you can prepare students better, and then you can follow up so they can share their photographs, or they can share their experiences of the experiment or whatever it was, so that you can follow up well online as well. But of course, you cannot get the physical skills that you can get in the place. So while we're in lockdown, or while we're not allowed to visit campus, of course, that is very difficult. But then I would just, you know, I was working at the Open University for 20 years when there was no campus. And so we would borrow other universities' campuses in the summer period and would go and do the wet stuff there, as it were. But there were many ways in which you could get people to understand the science and the fundamentals of the concepts and so on, without necessarily going to the place. You can do a visual tour of Diocletian's palace with the most wonderful video tour, you know, which you would never see as much of if you went there yourself. So you kind of make the best of it when you have to. When you don't have to, when we go back to normality, you make the best of both worlds.
I want to thank Dinah and Eileen for the way they answered those questions. I thought that was a really good discussion. Sadly, we have to stop there, but you might want to pick up some of those questions in the chat during the next half hour or so. In fact, what we've been doing is holding the chat open after the video and audio stops at 3 o'clock for another 30 minutes or so. And if you could stay online and answer further questions in the chat, that would be really appreciated. At this point, I'd like to welcome our other group of colleague presenters presenting in relation to academic work and academic careers. And in this presentation, we have Celia Whitchurch, who's an associate professor at UCL, and she's the project leader in relation to this piece of research. We also have Giulio Marini, who's the postdoc research fellow on this project and has conducted much of the data collection. And I think we also have online William Locke, who was the former head of this project, but has since gone to Australia, where he directs the Melbourne Centre for Study of Higher Education. Now, William I don't think is going to present, but he may want to come in during the discussion. So at this point, let me hand over to Celia.
Okay.
Hello, Celia.
Thanks very much. I think Trevor's going to put the PowerPoints up.
Excellent.
Thank you. Okay, I'm a bit short of time, so I may rush through one or two of these earlier PowerPoints. The first one, I think that's the second one actually, Trevor. Can you go back? Thank you. The first one gives an overview of the whole project, of which this presentation is about a part of that, which is to do with academic careers. But just so you know, this has been the whole project has been taking place over the last 4 years, really. The first phase involved interviews with 69 individuals in 8 UK institutions, 2 pre-1992, 3 Russell Group, 2 post-92 and 1 post-94. 49 of these individuals, or what I call in inverted commas rank and file academics, that is people who are not members of senior management teams. And they're the people we're focusing on today, because what we're interested in is how they've progressed in the course of 2 years. The second phase, Giulio was involved in designing a survey of 5 out of the 8 institutions, the 5 who agreed they had time to do it. And this was sent to all academic staff in the spring of 2019. And today he'll be looking at predictors of individuals who might be inclined to leave higher education or think about leaving higher education, which is particularly interesting, I think, post-COVID. And of course, I have to say that all the interviews, bar one, took place before the virus outbreak. So in a way, it is quite historic. But I think there will be points, I'm sure you will be raising points about the impact of COVID on all this. And the third phase was when we went back to repeat interviews with, again, rank and file academics to pick up their career development in the last 2 years. And that 39 of the 49 agreed to have a second interview. Right, next slide, please, Trevor. What of the data on looking at it, I mean, you spent about 6 months analysing the data, what it showed or seemed to show was we had a hunch that the models that were described in the literature didn't tend to be fluid or expansive enough to describe what really happens in careers, and they tend to be fairly fixed, describe structures or characteristics of individuals. And similarly, when we looked at the sort of criteria that we use within institutions and the assumptions that were made about people's careers, they tended to, well, firstly to be linear, and secondly to imply that there was a unitary direction of travel rather than people perhaps going backwards and forwards or stopping and starting, which is what tends to happen in practice. So although there's evidence in the literature of some people sort of being quite expansive in the way they interpret institutional progression criteria and push the boundaries using the structure and agency models, what didn't appear and what seemed to be happening in our data after the interviews was that individuals were actually holding on to different kinds of approaches, both at the same time and also between the 2 sets of interviews over the 2-year period. So it seemed that there were kind of spatial and longitudinal elements to what was going on with individuals as they enacted their careers. And they didn't necessarily, career is not necessarily a set piece, it's how an individual interprets the kind of structures that they have to work within. Okay, next slide, please. Trevor. Slide 3, thanks very much. This is really just summarising what we published in CG Working Paper 45, and as we're short of time, I could perhaps direct you to that paper if you want to think more about these categories that we came up with. But first of all, it did seem that there's a sort of well-known typology of careers, both in higher education and outside higher education, boundaried and boundary-less careers. And we definitely found these two categories. We called the first category mainstream. These were people that were very much looking to the next promotion and what they had to do for that, and often undertaking a kind of cost-benefit analysis about the value of certain activities and whether they wanted to spend time on particular activities, perhaps because they enjoyed them, or because they knew they might or might not contribute to the next promotion. But basically, these were people who saw themselves on a formal career track. The second group sort of corresponds with what the literature called boundaryless careers, and people who are undertaking activities often outside higher education because they're interested in them, and often in practitioner subjects. I mean, as we know, there's been a huge influx of people from the professions in the last 20 or 30 years into higher education, and these were people often with loyalties to their professional communities who wanted to keep up those links. But we found that these categories didn't cover all the people by any means, and we came up with another category which we call niche, and there's a considerable number of people who I suppose you could say had, for them, higher education is a vocation. For whatever reason, they want to focus on areas that interest them within the broad boundaries of their job description, of course. But they often kind of mould what they're doing so that they kind of mould the territory they're in so that they find it comfortable and rewarding. But some of these people also are trying to use what they were doing to contribute to what I call career credit, to be used for the next promotion, as it were. So there are all kinds of things going on. And so this first cut analysis really took the predominant approach in this first round of interviews and categorised people according to that. But as I say, the majority of participants showed that they held on to more than one approach. So you can't really categorise people with solid boundaries, as it were. Okay, next slide, please, Trevor. Okay, so what seemed to be happening was that people were expanding and contracting their activity almost across different kinds of spaces, and also across the 2-year time period. So we came up with this sort of image of the concertina approach to a career, which seemed to resonate with some of the things people were saying. And it was really very clear that people's relationships with colleagues, family, and wider networks were tremendously important to them in driving their career and what they were able to achieve in their careers. And it was almost universal that people mentioned these networks, close ties, weaker ties, etc. And they were also extending disciplinary space. As we know, the student experience now encompasses much more than being in the classroom. Obviously, virtual learning, the previous session focused on that, but a number of people were working online and felt that that wasn't really taken account of in career development or criteria for promotion. Many people were very aware of the employability agendas, diversity, inclusion, public engagement, all these things, the kind of peripheral activities to disciplinary activities, but people were interpreting disciplinary activity in the light of this kind of penumbra of activities and work interests. And the other thing that came out that we weren't really expecting was how people, in fact, lots of people who didn't really enjoy this kind of thing were having to understand that they needed a strategy if they were going to get on. And a number of people spoke of sort of tactics and knowing the right people, how to achieve recognition, how to source vertical networks, i.e. those people in the hierarchy who would be able to influence one's future. And that came out quite strongly, more strongly than certainly I would have expected. But of course, it has to be said that space and time are kind of linked as a resource, because if you're doing other activities, they're taking up time. But the important thing to say is that they were both seen as a resource. And one person, this was kind of encapsulated by one person who said, you have to play a long game where you choose which bits of the puzzle you can concentrate on at any one time. This person was in fact a reader, so they had had some experience of getting on in their career. But another person spoke about the patchwork of a career, sort of implying that you sort of moved from one patch of interest to another. And another person talked about putting together the jigsaw. So these are all kinds of spatial images, which we thought were quite interesting. Okay, thank you, Trevor. So, sort of moving on to the second round of interviews. Of course, we were very lucky being able to do this longitudinal study, and you know, that's what makes it unique in a way. So we did want to look at what was happening over time as well. And indeed, that was very, very interesting in that, as you can see, there seemed to be a shift from portfolio to mainstream and niche approaches as a primary approach. And the sort of first thought I had certainly was that, well, this was as a result of 15 of the 39 individuals having been promoted. So it seems that once people are promoted, they achieve a sort of settled status whereby they may be settling into their new promoted role rather than, or even trying for putting portfolio together for the next promotion. In fact, some people were doing that, in fact. But then other people might settle into more niche approach, kind of enjoying what they're doing at present, not particularly wanting to change anything. Think that sort of said, well, now I've got my senior lectureship, you know, I want to be able to relax a bit and really develop what I'm doing. And, you know, I may be able to use that for the next promotion, or I may not. You know, a lot of people talk about work-life balance, you know, wanting to have time for family and so on. So, and it seemed also that, so that the portfolio approach might be, in a way, a transitional approach, which involves exploring other opportunities and other possibilities when people are thinking about what they might do next, even whether they might leave higher education. And of course, all this may well have been informed by strike action that took place in early 2018. The first set of interviews were undertaken before that, but of course the second set of interviews were after that. So it may be there's a sort of drift to finding a more secure position, and obviously the COVID period may reinforce that, so we don't know that yet. Okay, so a couple of minutes, go on to the next slide, can we? Thank you. Okay, so the idea of concertina career also represents sort of how people in a way manipulated time. Obviously everybody's got the same amount of time, but people approach it differently. And in the long term, there was a lot of talk about stretching the timescale for a career, obviously among people, not just women, to accommodate families. Some people said, well, I want to have my family before I start applying for promotions and developing my research profile, etc. Other people said, well, I want to do it before I have a family. So, you know, there was quite a lot of juggling going on, and people, there's quite a nice quotation from somebody describing the kind of stops and starts that they'd had, if I can find it. It's not necessarily that you can even take the immediate opportunity in front of you. At times, personal reasons mean you can't. People are not necessarily equally placed at all to be able to take those routes, even when they are presented to them. And this was a professor, somebody who'd achieved a chair, and it was a woman, but they'd had a number of issues in their lives to do with children and elderly parents, and they described very well, you know, how they had achieved chair, but it had been not a linear trajectory at all. And in the short term, there was a lot of talk about trying to achieve blocks of time, often for research, of course, but often kind of discretionary time to pursue particular projects or interests that they wanted to develop. So another aspect of this was that, in fact, a number of people said that promotion, you have to be doing the job that you're trying to be promoted to before you get promoted to it. And I hadn't actually thought of that, but quite a number of people said that. So individuals are trying to sort of get ahead of themselves and you know, be working at that level, in a way getting ahead of time, so that they could feel secure in applying for the promotion. So I thought that was quite an interesting point. And then other people, often younger people, spoke about there being overlaps when they were completing one, often a research fellowship and perhaps starting a lectureship, but they, because there was nobody else to finish the previous project, they were working on that as well at the same time as starting another job. So again, that was kind of pushing a lot of things into the same amount of time. So I'll stop here, but just a final point, a number of sort of issues come out of all this, but one of which was the way people were making micro decisions all along the way about which activities were more valuable and which were less valuable, both in terms of time and, you know, sort of space they took up. And one person illustrated this quite vividly, because she said, well, I was appointed admissions tutor, and that really took up a lot of time, and it wasn't very valuable in terms of, you know, my next career move, so they relinquished that. But there were quite a lot of examples like that. So, and also those kinds of things would perhaps influence a shift in direction. I mean, somebody talked about a zigzag career and people sort of moving in different directions to try and achieve the outcomes they wanted. Simon, I don't want to take up any more time out of question time, so I had a summary slide which can go into the repository, as it were, but I'll stop there because I know you want time for questions. Okay.
Thanks, Celia. Look, perhaps you can run the summary slide while I'm talking. That's good. Yeah. Okay, that's great. I was very interested in your project, in the way you established these categories: mainstream, portfolio, and niche. These different ways that people live their lives and conduct a career, if you like. What's, I think, sensitive about these categories is the way they take into account both the structural conditions under which people must work and the agency, the willpower, their own capacity to shape their lives, which is limited by structure, but it's real and it's there. And the way in which you're able to plot how changes in the structural conditions then lead to different agential responses and possibilities. So, of course, the big question is the one that William Locke has posed in the chat. You know, it's what does it mean now that we've got casualisation and COVID-19 accelerating that experience of casualisation? What does that mean for the balance between these three categories of mainstream, portfolio, and niche? I might ask William to come in at this point. He might want to add to that and to say something further.
Thanks, Simon. Yes, I was just wondering, I mean, it's a bit unfair in a way because our research, and it's very fantastic to be partially involved even now from a distance. But I was just really interested in whether you think the pandemic-induced shutdown may have accelerated some trends and developments which would possibly close down options for the portfolio and niche approaches and rather reinforce the mainstream career, and indeed the metrics that Rosemary Dean mentions in the chat as a way of selecting people for promotion. I don't know what you think of that, Celia. I'm
sorry, I've just realised that we haven't allowed Giulio in. I'm sorry, Giulio, it wasn't intentional. Maybe he's got one slide, but so perhaps he can speak in a minute. Yeah, I mean, we interviewed 5 people on research fellow contracts, and a number of them were very portfolio oriented, I have to say. And it seems to me that in times of greater insecurity, I would suggest, and this is obviously it's speculative, but it seems to me from the data we've got that yes, mainstream approaches would be reinforced. But I also think that people will be looking elsewhere, and this is where Giulio comes in, because you know, they feel they need to have another option. And so it seems to me that niche is the category that will be squeezed. But I may be wrong, you know, we need to do another set of interviews.
Well, let's bring in Giulio, and after Giulio, I'll ask Gwyneth Hughes, and we have time, Camille Candico House and Rosemary Dean to ask a question or say something. So, Giulio.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I will have only one slide, one table for the audience. I beg Trevor to go to the last slide. Basically, it's from the survey, so a few figures. This one, thank you. This is the only one I'm going to talk about today. It's about people who are expressing the will that they're planning to leave higher education. So staff leaving higher education because they're not satisfied for some reason. This is quite important in my opinion, because it is not just employers getting rid of employees, it is also employees saying goodbye to higher education. Now, these data are from non-Russell Group universities from England, Scotland, and Wales. So it is very important to specify that there are no Russell Group universities in this sample, because I guess that would change slightly. The only point I would like to make today with you is the difference by qualification, by having PhD or not. As you can imagine, these kind of teaching intensive universities, historically, they don't have many people with PhD. It is increasing. They usually try to get a PhD or a professional doctorate. But as you can see from the table, those saying, yes, I would like to leave higher education, they're more likely to be people with a PhD. So the main point is, in this big season of redundancies, I wonder if higher education, especially non-Russell Group institutions, will have staff with lower qualification, or saying people less qualified, so potentially hampering the quality of teaching and also research. And that's something that we are not looking at, because we look at people losing jobs, but I think it is as well an issue we should start to discuss in literature as well, because this is usually unusual. When you talk about attrition, retention, it's about students. But I think quality of staff is an increasing issue, because say just one single word about qualitative interviews, it was astonishing to me as an interviewer, realizing the extent to which interviewees were unhappy. It was very, very widespread. I mean, might be happy for material reasons, but overall, I would say the first adjective in my mind is unhappy.
Well, thanks, Giulio. Well, you put some more issues on the table. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I mean, Gwyneth Hughes, I think, has raised questions about early career academics and the effects of the pandemic and accelerating possibly emphasis on online learning, and that becoming a more necessary part of the ECA portfolio. Gwyneth, would you like to come in?
Well, I just wanted to just maybe add a bit more of an optimistic note to the idea about casualisation and COVID crisis, in that we're now maybe changing our view of health and social care workers as a result of the crisis, for the wonderful work they've done. maybe universities might start to value digital innovators and technical support people, and there might be more niche opportunities for maybe younger people who've got those skills.
Celia?
On mute myself. I seem to have disappeared, sorry. Yeah, I mean, that I agree, and that also brings into the picture people. This also brings into the picture people who are not necessarily on academic contracts, but who may be undertaking academic kind of what might be seen as what I call penumbra academic activities. And we did actually interview some of those people because they were presented to us for interview. And they may well be highly qualified and have doctorates. So I think that may increase the number of people in what I've called third space roles in previous work, in between sort of pure disciplinary work and what we call professional work. There isn't really a word for it, but I mean, I think that would be a very interesting project in its own right. And in fact, we interviewed, I think, 4 or 5 people who were pretty heavily involved in online work, and MOOCs indeed, who felt that they were very much on their own. They were very isolated from their institution because they didn't fit into workload models. They had difficulty getting credit for the next career move, etc., etc. And I'm sure that will change rapidly. Yeah, so that is interesting.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more, and that'll be it. Rosemary Deem. Hello, Rosemary.
Hi. So my question is really about promotion, because Celia talked quite a lot about that, about people sort of thinking that some of them had to start preparing for the next one as soon as they got one, that people were kind of thinking that maybe they had to do all of those things. And I think on the whole that the promotion system in UK universities is very, very traditional. It's very metrics driven. There's a kind of series of layers you have to go through. There's a huge amount of reliance on references, which can be problematic because, it depends, who writes them, and it depends how you interpret them and what stage in the process they're used. I mean, there are certainly some European universities experimenting with very different ways of doing it. I can't give too much detail because it's confidential, but I've been involved in assessing one such scheme, and it's really trying to get people to talk about why what they do matters, and they get interviewed at the end of the process and questions that might be asked to them. I'm just thinking about something that's more imaginative, might be thing that's more, because we have a very kind of old-fashioned approach to promotion, which nevertheless takes an enormous amount of time. So, I mean, I know it's very different to what you're doing in one sense, but I think that question, you see, Giulio's work particularly about people who leave. One of the reasons people leave is they feel like they're not getting anywhere and they don't have any prospects of getting anywhere. It's not just the overload, but it's also that sense of where am I going to go in this? How far am I going to get?
I mean, shall I reply
yes,
to that?
Go ahead.
There was a lot of evidence of people feeling they had to play the game, as it were. And one senior academic professor who's quite experienced in promotions, as Rosemary is, did say the younger people are much more switched on about this than my generation was. So, I mean, I think there are 2 aspects to it. I think it has become a game. People are more switched on, but the question of whether this could be modified in any way is probably critical for the future. But I certainly think there will need to be more leeway about what counts as what I call career credit. I think this may well be relaxed, particularly post-COVID.
Well, thanks. I want to thank all 3 members of the research team who've spoken in the webinar. That's Celia, Giulio and William. And to thank all of you as participants today. I want to apologise to Camille and Suhendi and Lynn and others who had a question coming. There's no doubt that academic work and careers are one of the issues that unifies us across the world. There are, I think all systems are facing an insecure environment, and coming out of the pandemic, the majority of systems are likely to be facing financial crisis, which will play into career insecurity, and particularly the perilous position of early career academics and early career researchers. These categories are our future. There's a danger that they will go missing in the next 5 years, that we'll have a gap with a whole generation without opportunities to develop academic work. And it's something which we need to be alert to now, so we can begin to prepare the policy and administrative spaces to safeguard the position of young people in the system. I want to thank you all again for participating, and to remind you that we are also online at 2 o'clock UK time on Thursday, where we'll have Jonathan Adams from King's College in London, who's a megastar of research on universities and on research and science. So we look forward to his presentation, where he'll raise some fundamental questions about where higher education is going. So thank you again, and do stay online for the chat part of the discussion, chat only part, which will run until 3:30. So goodbye for now. See you next Thursday.
Bye, everyone.